Good afternoon and welcome to our meeting on the disproportionate impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on women, 3 case studies. I'm happy to say that we as a Diplomatic Academy are cooperating here with the Canadian Embassy in Austria. Welcome to the Canadian Ambassador, Heidi Hulan. Good to see you this afternoon. And I think it's not by chance that Canada and the Canadian Embassy is cooperating here, because Canada has a strong record on trying to work against women inequalities and is also, as we know, one of those countries where the COVID-19 pandemic has been so far treated in a quite respectable way and in a good way compared to other countries. But this afternoon, our topic is inequalities of women, which are, one might say, accelerated by the crisis. And to a certain extent, people say that the COVID-19 crisis is a fire accelerator also for inequality of women. And we all know why this is so when we look at domestic violence, when we look at job insecurity, when we look at the percentage of women working in the care working field. And I'm happy to say that it is not an event, as far as I understand, about lamenting about inequalities, but it's about trying to compare how 3 different countries reacted and react to the crisis. In our case, it's Canada, the United Kingdom, and Austria. Best practice is always something that we should work on. And it's not the first time that I, from the Diplomatic Academy, saying that never let a good crisis go to the waste. So it's really worth making the best of the given situation. Before I pass on to the introduction of Ambassador Hulan, just let me say, because I'm a man, I'm the only man here on board, as I can see, there might be also some positive elements for reducing inequalities already present in this crisis about women empowerment. As I see it, for instance, the internet literacy of female pupils and students, which used to be a bit lower than for male students, might be getting more equal now in this given crisis. And I would also say there is a higher awareness of these inequalities between women and men now because of the crisis. So for women empowerment, I see positive things. And actually, I also have to say there is a lower death rate, as far as we know so far, for women than for men. But this is everything that I found as something where maybe men are worse off than women in all other fields. I'm very much looking forward to see how 3 different countries react to the crisis on our topic of inequalities regarding women. So I'm looking forward to the discussion and pass on to Ambassador Hulan.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Brix. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for collaborating with our mission in organizing today's event. A warm welcome to all of the panelists as well, and to everyone who is watching this event online. It's a great honor to be able to moderate a discussion on an important and timely issue here today. I'd like to just say a couple of words about the choreography of today's event, and then perhaps just a few words before I pass on and introduce the speakers. I will start by introducing the 3 panelists: Anjum, Sultana, Judith Derndorfer, and Melanie, Sully. There will then be, each of them will have time to make a presentation of their own. There will then be a little bit of time for a discussion amongst the panelists as well, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. For those who are following this event online, you can pose questions either in the Zoom chat or as a comment in the Diplomatic Academy's Facebook chat. Just checking my notes, and yes, that's correct. So let me just start by saying that the fact that this event is taking place in March is not a coincidence. It's only a couple of weeks ago that we celebrated International Women's Day on March the 8th. In Canada, the theme for International Women's Day in 2021 was, quote, feminist recovery, which was intended to recognize all of the women who are on the front lines of addressing the COVID-19 response, but also the broader challenges that face the gendered communities. At the same time, I'm quite happy that this event is not taking place on March 8th itself, because really underscoring the importance of considering gender in all of our economic and social activities as a government is something that we do all year round, and that we must do all year round. And in the international community, it's something we need to do a better job of handling and treating all year long. This March also, I think it's escaped no one's notice, marks a 1-year anniversary of the acute phase 1 of the crisis, and a year since communities around the world started to confront lockdowns and significant restrictions to their personal freedoms. We all know that COVID-19 has exacerbated existing economic, health, and social inequalities, and the disadvantages for women are clear. The crisis has put at real risk hard-won gains for women in the domain of gender equity. And it's also increased risks to women from gender-based violence and femicide. Today, I hope we can learn a little bit more about the effect of the pandemic in Austria, Canada, and the United Kingdom. We will also hear about how we can learn from the events of the past year and work to ensure that future crises of this nature, of which there will almost certainly be a number, do not have such a gendered impact. And so with that, I'll just finish my introductory remarks, and let me take a moment or two to introduce the 3 panelists. I'll start with the final panelist. Dr. Melanie Sully is the director of Go Governance, as well as an editor, writer, and consultant. I'm extremely grateful to you, Dr. Sully, for your collaboration in setting up this panel and working with my team at the embassy to do so. Dr. Sully has researched the effects of the pandemic in the United Kingdom, and I look forward to hearing more about that work. Judith Derndorfer is research assistant at the Institute for Distribution Issues at YWCA Vienna. In her current research, she and her colleagues are investigating the effects of the first lockdown in March 2020 on the distribution of unpaid work in households in Austria. Judith, I'm looking forward to your presentation as well. And our first panelist today is Anjum Sultana, the National Director of Public Policy and Strategic Communications at YWCA Canada, Canada's largest and oldest gender equity organization. Anjum is the primary author and operations lead for a feminist economic recovery plan, making the economy work for everyone, the first nationally focused recovery plan of its kind. We're really delighted that you could be here to join us from Toronto. And so good morning to you, Anjum, to share the results of your work and its recommendations for Canada. So with that, I'd like to turn the floor to you, Anjum, and when you are finished, Judith, feel free to just take the floor directly, followed by Dr. Sully. Melanie, you take the floor immediately following Judith, and then I will come back with a few questions to pose to the 3 of you for a bit of a moderated discussion between the panelists. Over to you, Anjum, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Master Hulan, and also thank you, Master Brix, for the warm welcome. Again, my name is Anjum Sultana, and I'm here to share some of the work that the YWCA Canada has been doing with our partners. And I think the work really speaks to the importance of civil society coming together with government, private sector, labor, academia, and all sectors of society. So this is some of that cumulative work, and I think it offers interesting insights, but also hopefully lessons as well. So as mentioned, we are the largest and oldest gender equity organization in the country. So sadly, this is not the first pandemic our organization has faced. We were there during the 1917-18 flu. And when we look back through the archival records of the YWCA, we see that what was true then is true now, that in times of crisis, what we need more than anything is care and community. And when we talk about some of the recommendations that the YWCA Canada with our partners put forward, those are some of the key central messages. We have a presence in 300 communities across the country. We work in 9 provinces and 2 territories. And because of that, we have a pan-Canadian perspective. And this was really important during the beginning of the crisis, because as things were happening, as the pandemic was impacting Canada, we were seeing in real time what were the challenges, but also the opportunities. And for us, that really shouldered our understanding that we can't just talk about response. We need to also think about recovery and address some of the root causes that created the vulnerabilities in the first place. And we truly believe, because of our experience on the ground in communities and our work doing national advocacy, we can bring these 2 perspectives together to really create that systemic change that I know everyone here is looking for to advance gender equality in Canada and beyond. So in terms of the key messages, if there's 3 things I could leave you with, these would be the following. We need an explicit gendered focus for Canada's and global post-pandemic recovery. The fact is, our society has never seen a crisis quite like this. The severe gendered impacts requires a new playbook. And that's what our work on a feminist economic recovery plan offers, a new playbook to address the type of crisis that is currently being experienced all over the world. And because of that, because of who has been impacted in the crisis, they need to be at the center of recovery conversations. And not only that, at the leadership table. So women, two-spirit, and gender diverse people must be at the core of the work that we do as a country, but also globally as well. And for us, in our humble opinion at the YWCA Canada and our partners, Canada can and should be playing a leading role. And to the credit of the government, I'll share some of the things that we've seen following some of our advocacy that really shows the critical importance of civil society and government working together to create the systemic change we want. So what were the gendered impacts? So again, across the globe, we've seen every nation grapple with this. What does it look like in Canada? So we've seen 2 different parts of it. And there's so much more, but for the purposes of this presentation, I've streamlined it a bit. But we've seen impacts for women at work, and then we've also seen impacts for women at home. So in work, we saw that many of the sectors that are women majority, so think tourism, hospitality, retail services, they were the hardest hit because of pandemic-related public health measures. So in March, a year ago, 60% of the losses in Canada in terms of jobs were experienced by women. And this unfortunately continues to hold true. We've seen recovery in many sectors, but women are still not at the same rates as men. We've actually seen a recent report talk about 12 times as many women, specifically mothers, have exited the labor market in Canada compared to fathers. So this really speaks to also the rise in unpaid care work, which I'll get to in a bit. The other aspect of it is women were losing their jobs in women majority sectors, but they were also on the front lines. So globally, we know that 70% of the global health workforce are women. This is also the case in many parts of the world, including in Canada. In Canada, 56% of the workers are in what we call the 5 C's. So these are workers in the caring industries, in cashiering, in catering, in cleaning, and clerical. So they were on the front lines of this crisis. So they were also exposed to COVID or exposed to many of the challenges that come with working in those industries. So we saw on 2 fronts, women being impacted, women workers. We also saw challenges in the home. So because of schools being closed, because of COVID-19, to stay safe from COVID-19, and also the rise of remote work to stay safe from COVID-19, women are experiencing what we've seen as a triple burden. So not only are they providing caregiving duties, perhaps to young children or older adults like their parents, they're also having to homeschool their children at the same time, and also having to continue to work. So this has created a lot of unpaid care responsibilities, but also a lot of additional mental health pressures as well. So a survey by our colleagues at Oxfam Canada found that 71% of Canadian women have experienced increased anxiety, depression, stress due to this unpaid care work. We've also seen one of the public health measures is to stay at home, to stay safe from COVID, but that requires you to have a home that's safe and affordable. And so we've also seen a rise in gender-based violence across the world, and Canada is also not immune to this. So we've seen in Canada a 20-30% increase. So given this context, and this is just skimming the surface, what can we do? What should we do? So this was the central question behind the Feminist Economic Recovery Plan. So we did this in partnership with the University of Toronto's Institute for Gender and the Economy. So I think this was such a wonderful partnership because we were seeing issues on the ground in real time. We partnered with the academic institution, and together we were able to bring forward robust recommendations. And I also want to say throughout this presentation, you may see these beautiful illustrations. This was done by young women of color, and actually the entire report throughout it, we really invested in women-led businesses to make this report come to life. And that's actually one of our recommendations as well. Let's think about, as different institutions, businesses, stakeholders, how do we invest in women-led businesses, businesses led by Black, Indigenous, racialized communities, people living with disabilities? This is one of the solutions to our recovery. Invest directly in those communities. So what were our recommendations? So I won't go into the full plan. You can visit www.feministrecovery.ca to see it in full, but you can see here a snapshot. We had 8 pillars and 27 recommendations, starting with intersectionality, which is understanding we can't have a one-size-fits-all approach. When we talk about women, we have to look at women from different perspectives, race, class, sexual orientation, and so much more. So that was part of our set of recommendations, and specifically calling for disaggregated data. Another aspect was investing in the care economy. We currently in Canada are striving towards a national early learning and childcare system. And research is telling us if we invest in that in Canada, that can not only address the unpaid care work that we saw increase during the COVID pandemic, that would enable women's labor market participation. That would also return to the Canadian government $29 billion a year, and that's a modest amount. So these are some of the recommendations because of what we saw on the ground. We also see this pandemic as an opportunity to push that over the finish line. So just a couple things about our plan. So first, it was the first nationally focused plan of its kind. And since we put this out, we've actually had colleagues in South Africa, Northern Ireland, in the state of New York, Australia, reach out to us and say, how can we also push forward a feminist economic recovery plan? And we were actually inspired by the great work done in the state of Hawaii, which actually was the first jurisdiction to push this forward. We also talk a lot about in our plan about how do we disrupt our measures of success. So it's very important to look at GDP numbers and job numbers, but let's also break that down a bit. Are we actually tracking income inequality and using that as a measure of success? The more we can address that. Are we looking at the jobs that are coming back? Are they decent jobs with paid sick leave and other benefits? And also, as a country, should we also be looking at gender-based violence rates and housing and homelessness? So these are some of the aspects. We also talk a lot about systemic racism and also looking at gender-based violence, because for us, in the work that we do, we can't have an economic recovery without addressing hate, violence, and fear of all kinds. And I think, what recently happened in the state of Atlanta in the US, in Georgia in the US, speaks to that, that rise of anti-Asian sentiment. These are all things that are also important for economic recovery. So I'm going to fast forward a bit, but just to show some of the impact of our plan and the way in which Canada, the Canadian government, has responded. So we actually saw our government put forward messaging about needing to have a feminist intersectional response to this pandemic and recovery. So that was much appreciated because we need to see that in the rhetoric as well. One of the things Canada has committed to is creating an action plan for women in the economy. So this was actually one of our recommendations in our plan. And I'm happy to report actually, YWCA Canada's CEO is on a task force related to that plan. We also currently have in the role of Minister of Finance, Minister Freeland, the first woman in the role. And she's also talked about the importance of having a feminist approach to post-pandemic recovery. So some of the things we've seen is targeted money for reskilling for women in other impacted communities, We also saw the action plan, which I mentioned, and we also saw a commitment to moving towards an early learning and childcare system. So what is next? So we're actually very much looking forward to, hopefully in a couple of weeks, the upcoming budget. And we're hoping that some of the commitments that have been laid out, we start to see money being rolled out, whether it's for the National Early Learning and Childcare System, the Action Plan on Women in the Economy, or a National Action Plan on Gender-Based Violence. We've been really heartened by the approach and the response of the Canadian government. And I think we continue to work together. We wish to work together as partners to push forward the needs of women, but also the solutions they bring to the table. So with that, I'd like to close, but sincerely thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A. And what I'll do, I'll put some of the links that I mentioned in the chat so people can have that as well. Thank you so much.
So I'm going to present to you today our findings from a study about multiple burden during COVID-19, so working from home and the distribution of unpaid work within households in Austria. So my name is Judith Derndorfer, but this is joint work with colleagues of mine, so Franziska Distelbacher, Vanessa Lechinger, Katharina Mara, and Eva Six. So what was the motivation of our study? So we started almost 1 year ago, as it was already mentioned that this kind of is the 1 year anniversary of the pandemic. So in the beginning of the pandemic, there was this debate whether the pandemic and its consequences is a curse or a blessing for women and gender relations. So there were some assumptions, hypotheses that during the lockdown, men will take on more unpaid work since they spend more time at home, and this will actually be good for gender equality. So they will increase their share, and this will have long-lasting positive impact on gender equality. And the second side of the debate was that actually women will do the additional unpaid work alone, and this will have very negative consequences on gender equality during the pandemic, but also long-lasting in the aftermath of the pandemic. So this was the reason for us to see, okay, how can we actually study this and how is the situation in Austria? So what we did in March is my colleagues and I, we designed an online survey that we distributed in March and April, and that was filled out. So it was an online questionnaire. It was filled out by around 2,100 respondents. I have to say here now that this is not representative of the Austrian population, but we have a very specific sample. So as you can see on the slides, that there were 3/4 of the respondents were female. Almost every second respondent was from Vienna, and we have a lot of academics. But we feel that even though it is not representative, it does not matter so much because we know that especially highly educated people were able to work from home during the pandemic. And also we know that on average, the higher the education, the more gender progressive norms you have. So this is kind of, if we see that there is kind of a backlash in that sample, we can assume that this is also might be even worse for the whole population. So just keep this in mind. And what we do not only have information on the person filling it out, we also have information on the partners. So we know their education, their time use. So we have some additional information as well. What we did with this study, with the survey, is we wanted to know the effect of the first Corona lockdown. So the sampling period was in April and May in Austria, 2020. So there was already some easing of the lockdown, but actually schools were still closed and kindergartens were also mostly closed. So we wanted to study the effect of the lockdown on the division of unpaid work, about the workplace and work quality while working from home, and also mental well-being. So some issues were already raised by Anjum, and I think we can see that this is really a global phenomena and not country specific, that this happens, sadly, mostly elsewhere as well. So let me start with our findings. So this is a figure about the division of unpaid work before the pandemic. So we asked the respondents, how was household work and childcare, which I will show you later on, distributed between you and your partner before the pandemic and during the pandemic. And what we see here now is already that unpaid work, in this case household work, is not equally shared, neither before the pandemic nor during the pandemic. So in 55% of households, the women did the majority. In around 30%, it was equally shared, so indicated by number 5 here. And there were only around 15% of the households where men did a larger share of the household work. And the colors here indicate whether this changed during the pandemic. So for example, staying at here where the couples shared the unpaid work equally, we see that in those blue colored, that actually the division didn't change. And overall, in around 50% of households, the division of unpaid work didn't change. But what we see is here, also 4 and 5, when before the pandemic, household work was roughly equally shared. If there was a change, it was more in the light of re-traditionalization. So women, the purple part, took on a larger share during the pandemic than before. So these was in couples where there was a gender equal division before the pandemic. We also see that in couples where the women did a lot more than their male partners, these were couples where either it didn't change or there was a slight change where the man actually did more during the pandemic. So, and what the third part is that this is the black line, which indicates the overall division of labor during the pandemic, that there wasn't large change. So there was a bit of a polarization of the division. So we see here more couples where women do everything of the housework, and also some couples where there are more men doing more housework. But overall, the pandemic didn't change much. And this we also see for childcare. And please remember that this was really a time when parents had to do homeschooling. There were no grandparents who could take care of their children. And also, so the sheer amount of unpaid work was very big, especially for childcare. And again, we see that it's in Austria, very traditional. So in 2/3 of the couple, the woman does more of the unpaid work. In around 25%, childcare was equally shared. And again, very few couples where the male partner is primarily in charge of caregiving. And again, we see that some change within the household, kind of re-traditionalization in couples where childcare was already equally or almost equally split before the pandemic. And when there was, that there are also more couples now during the pandemic where women do all the complete childcare. So this large amount of unpaid work during the pandemic. Just the first take-home message that there was indeed some changes within the household. So things changed in the division of labor, but not the overall distribution of labor. Women are still the primary caregiver, and even in times of crisis, even when the amount of unpaid work goes up by a lot, they still do most of it, or a large part of it. And that there is a tendency of re-traditionalization, so this kind of backlash that women also felt that with some open questions and some answers that they felt that they were kind of back in the 50s, that they were having some gender roles, doing things that they kind of thought that they already have overcome in their lives. So this was really a big experience for a lot of women. And next, I want to talk about how those couples experienced working from home during the first lockdown. And here I have a figure where we asked people about their experience on working from home, whether they could really do their tasks better at home, or whether they could concentrate, whether they had their own room to work, and also reconciliation of family and work, whether they were working on weekends and accessible outside working hours, And this figure is only for couples, for respondents with children under the age of 15. Because we see when there are no children in the household, we don't see any gender-specific differences. People were able to work from home just fine. But when there are children, we see that it is more challenging for mothers. So they more seldomly had their own room to work. They found it more difficult to concentrate and just had a harder time at working from home while taking care of the children at the same time. And we also asked about the primary childcare arrangements for these couples. And one of these reasons why mothers had a hard time is because they were the primary caregivers. So women were more likely to answer that they took care of their children and they were in the same room, whereas the men answered that it was their partner taking care of their kids. So this was really the situation, doing homeschooling, working, doing everything at the same time. And it was more mothers that were in charge of that, who had these challenging times. And last, we also asked them about how they coped with it. And here I just want to show you that women more strongly agreed with statements such as, I feel guilty of neglecting my paid work, and I feel guilty for neglecting my children. So also this kind of mental load, this multiple burden of women is quite different for men and for women, because they had the feeling they had to do everything at the same time, and they were really struggling with it. Okay, so as I just showed you, reconciliation of work and family, particularly challenging for mothers, and because they most often supervise their children in the same room, they didn't have a room that they could just close and work and concentrate on better. And this multiple burden really led to psychological impact, so impacted their mental well-being, and they had feelings of guilt regarding their children and their work. So let me finish. I want to reiterate that this is just a sample of highly educated couples in Austria during the very first lockdown, which was very strict and quite different than the lockdowns that followed. And I also want to say that it's not the case that men didn't increase their amount that they spent on unpaid work, but still the overall division, their share on average didn't change much. So to come back to the overall theme of today's webinar, I want to state that women disproportionately were affected by the pandemic. And as I showed you, not only in the unpaid sphere, so concerning household work and childcare, but also in the paid sphere, because these two spheres are actually cannot be separated. And also during the lockdown, they were kind of merged into the home. And this also had kind of feedback consequences. So they experienced work from home differently. And also in Austria, women were more affected by unemployment than men were. We know from Germany that mothers were more likely to reduce their working time. And as already Anjum stated, same for Austria, that also women were more likely to work in the essential jobs, all these things. So really women took a harder hit, and this is kind of new compared to the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. So we really need to focus on the gender-specific effects. So kind of the last point I want to raise, what can be done? So we should talk about revaluing the essential jobs to improve the economic situation of women, divide unpaid work more equally. I think this is really key. And 1-2 measures could be increase the availability of high quality childcare facilities, but also promote gender norms, because in Austria it's still quite gender conservative, so there needs to be done. Things can be in the business world, can be starting with kindergartens, but really start early on, because if a crisis hits, as we can see now, it really goes back to traditional gender norms. And I think there is a lot that needs to be done. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for these wonderful presentations. And obviously there are a lot of similarities. I'd like firstly to thank the Canadian Embassy for the fantastic cooperation. We had to do it obviously all online. And thank you to Armin and also to Kelly in Vienna for this. And also thanks to the Diplomatic Academy and Ambassador Brix for his introduction, which was also quite an input, I think. In the UK, today is the first year anniversary of the lockdown, which came, as we know, tragically for human life, a week later than it should have come. And I think at the beginning, there was a kind of almost a peculiar euphoria idealism, because one had the impression this would not last too long. In this kind of crisis situation, the UK did what it always does, was to think about the World War, the Second World War, and the Dunkirk spirit, and revive this solidarity within the country, and almost a kind of, we will defeat the virus, you know, on the beaches, we will defeat it in the hills, we will defeat it, we will never surrender kind of spirit, which also was reiterated by the Queen in her video messages to the nation. And I think not just this division in society between women and men, but also a generation split opened with this, because to be quite honest, I do not think that young people in the UK have a clue what Dunkirk was, and all this must have just washed over them. So as time went on, the whole thing now has developed also a political dimension. The UK vaccination program has been amazingly successful. It has actually even surprised those people who I think masterminded it. So now it becomes a debate about, well, we can't keep on with lockdown forever. We need to go back to our fundamental freedoms. And this advocates of the going back to freedoms, ending the lockdown, is very much articulated by people who are were and are in the Brexit camp. That is, you have a group of people who lost the Brexit cause and now have, you know, an anti-lockdown cause. That's the right wing of the Conservative Party. It was the former Brexit Party. And so this also poses a kind of potent danger for democracy, which also we see in the eruption of violence in major cities, compounding a feeling of huge frustration. And also, as was mentioned in one presentation, the Black Lives Matter movement, which last year resulted in the violent removal of a statue to a slave dealer in my home city. And again, this week in that very city has resulted in violence against the lockdown. So I think what we have here is a very dangerous cocktail of various frustrations which have been thrown up, tensions in generations, tensions between gender, tensions also in class, and tensions within the political elite, because one also not forget that these anti-lockdown, former anti-Brexit group are overwhelmingly male. They also, we can see similar tendencies in other European countries where more far-right movements have been in the forefront of sort of poo-pooing the coronavirus and its effects and arguing for an end to lockdown. So I think that basically a background from what I see to this more political dimension of the problem. And as was mentioned in one of the presentations, very important is to work with communities. And the problem in the UK was working with communities threw up yet again another political rival problem, because the communities are very strong now in some of the northern cities where there are directly elected mayors, and they are very often of a different political persuasion than the government, the central government in London, and obviously had their own agenda to score points on. So that you've got a lot of tension between communities and the central government, and maybe similarities here with Austria in a sort of dispute on what to do next between the federal states and the federal government. So I think we can see some similarities, and there are a lot of kind of things to go on here. But basically, I got a presentation which you can see. Next slide, please, if that's possible. So again, which we have seen from the other case studies, the already existing tensions were exacerbated. On the political level, legislation was passed in haste with no consultation, and there was not any consideration of gender factored in to assess what impact this must have. Very often, normally actually when we pass legislation in Parliament, you have regulatory impact assessments. Well, this just kind of went by the board in the haste to do something. A year on, though, there's no real excuse for this, because we should have actually thought about what the impact could be. Also, it must be said that Parliament and government have proportionally less women at the top table on the negotiation. Next slide, please. In the visibility in the media, women did not appear very much, which is actually a bit of a similarity to Austria. Now, the one difference is that at the press conference, there was not a quad of males, but a quintet, and these regularly appeared. Now, this has a message to be sent that really, for many women, it's like, what has it got to do with me? I mean, do they really understand? Have they firsthand experience of what is going on? So the chief medical officer was also male and regularly appeared at this press conference. The deputies, very often, women are second fiddle. They occasionally were present. I think there was one occasion when a female deputy had a different opinion completely from the Prime Minister and then seemed not to appear anymore for some mysterious reason. Anyway, they set up a parliamentary inquiry into gender. There is a specific committee for gender issues, women and inequality in Parliament. And they noted all these things, which I've summarized, and that there was a kind of institutional thoughtlessness when passing laws as far as gender was concerned, and that there was a kind of blokey culture at the top table. That is a sort of guy culture, which some attributed to the fact that many of these in the cabinet males went to single-sex schools, elite male schools, and really this kind of culture of sexism, discrimination, whatever you want to call it, is systemic, pretty endemic anyway, and this just came on top of everything. Next slide, please. So there was a failure to consider what impact there would be on the labour market, on childcare facilities. Women who had a less secure job on contracts, they were more involved in homeschooling. That has repercussions for being employed in the future again. So in future, one recommendation, there should be equality impact assessment of laws. To do that, we need more data on who receives supports, who receives grants, which industries. Are these going to more industries which are more employing more men than women? Who is actually getting support from government? There was an opinion poll showed that women were far more cautious on lifting the lockdown, that they did not on the whole see that going to a pub or a golf course was terribly important in comparison with protecting health. I think that is a classic example, perhaps exaggerated, of what we might call this guy or blokey culture. Next slide, please. Now, an important point was raised by Ambassador Brix as the only male in the group today. Well, I think in all these things with women that we talk about, whether it's on March the 8th, that there should be not a feeling that men are isolated from all this, that the only road to success will be actually working with men. And there was an effect on men that was actually documented because there were males who lost their jobs and also therefore became very depressed because they'd been the breadwinner in the family or the main breadwinner and had this feeling, particularly in working class environment, that it was their duty to go out and earn the bread for the family. And when they lost that, they felt useless. And so they turned to alcohol. Although the pubs were shut, then you would take it home. And that impacted again, in turn, on women who would be the victims of such violence. And so here, civil society, religious groups can help. I read in Austria that the Caritas in some of the federal states recognized this problem and offered assistance to males who were feeling very depressed and had lost jobs for the time being. And really, that would be also a way of indirectly helping. Next slide, please. Now, this I took from King's College, University London, and shows you how different gender relates to the pandemic, to the virus. And so the key feature, basically, males were least compliant with the lockdown. They wanted it all over in a jiffy. Those key features, I think, you know, it's fairly self-explanatory. Next slide, please. Women were more likely during this crisis to have actually gone out their way to help others. They called friends, they asked family members or neighbors, you know, do you need help? Can I do some shopping for you? What do you need? And I think so for men, typically in the crisis, the reaction was to sort of close everything off and withdraw within themselves, which also was not terribly helpful to them and certainly not helpful to anyone else. So I think also there is some need for looking at these different psychological attitudes and trying to, you know, throw out a lifeline in these terms to male as well. Next slide, please. Yeah, I think this bears out what we've already seen in the other two presentations, that those most impacted on changes in the workplace were clearly women. And therefore the long-term prospect of recovery from this crisis will have a more severe impact in that labour market on women rather than men. That is an Ipsos Mori poll. Next one, please. And women actually thought about, you can see here how it kind of panned out over the last year. A lot when the lockdown was introduced, what attitudes there were to it and the support for it, which now, as the vaccine program is becoming more successful, more pressure on the government to actually open up. Next one, please. So, summarizing that women had helped the lonely and elderly more and proportionately. In Parliament itself, the social distancing meant that there were less members of Parliament physically present. Voting could take place remotely or by other means. I think this is something which might be a good point for the future, that lawmakers who are on parental leave, whether it's men or women, could not be deprived of a vote in Parliament, which has been the case in many parliaments to date, but could actually remotely vote. If this been done in the pandemic, why can't it be done in the future? The Fawcett Society, which is very concerned with women and the rights of women, noted that more women were in jobs that were closed during the pandemic. Therefore, they bore the brunt of the emotional and financial fallout. Next one, please. Well, as you can see, that was the end. And I look forward to discussion and any further comments or questions. Back to you, Heidi.
Thank you very much to all of our three presenters for their fascinating presentations. We have about 25 minutes for a discussion. We'll also take a couple of questions. I don't believe we've had any questions in the chat yet. I'm not sure about the Diplomatic Academy's Facebook page, but do let me know. In any case, there are a couple of areas where I would not mind probing a little bit farther, and I encourage the panelists to also ask each other questions if they would like to delve deeper in any particular area. And I guess the question that we all face is, you know, what are the key challenges as we look towards a recovery, particularly in advancing gender equity? You know, what are the barriers that we're going to face and have to overcome in order to make sure that the recovery planning comes out right for women? That's one question. And second, I'd like to just, well, there's several things. I wouldn't mind talking, if we have time, about the political dimensions of this, because we've seen in so many places in the world also the co-optation of the kind of the anti-lockdown frustration and anti-vax campaigns by the far right, and interested in views on that, but maybe come back to that. As we look at what are the biggest challenges to post-pandemic recovery in the gender domain, I think it would be useful to unpack a little bit more the whole idea of intersectionality. Anjum, you said something, I don't know if I got it quite right, but basically you said can't have an economic recovery without also tackling hate, violence, and fear, which is something we believe very much in Canada. But you can imagine the voices internationally and maybe even in some parts of Canada saying, hang on now, are you sure? And certainly within government, it is always the case that when we talk about intersectionality, there are always concerns, legitimate concerns, that get raised about the sheer complexity of what we are trying to address, and whether there's a saw-off point after which trying to address too much complexity means that you don't actually accomplish anything. And so I would really like to, partly as a means of kind of making the case even more clear in our own minds, drill down a little bit about what we mean by intersectionality and how we see those linkages. But I put the question generally on how do we address existing misconceptions about gender equity, and what are the biggest barriers we face in the recovery phase when it comes to those issues, to all three of you. And I don't know who would like to go first. Maybe I'll take you in the order that you spoke. So I'll go Anjum, then Judith, and then Melanie.
Yeah, thanks so much for asking this very important question, because there's often a challenge, right? And there's a resistance to adopting such measures. So I know in Canada right now at the federal level, but depending on different provinces and territories, there is slowly an adoption of an intersectional gender-based analysis. And the fact is we saw this very clearly in the pandemic, and we will see this in the recovery. We can either pay now or invest and focus on this intersectional response to the recovery now, or we could do it later. And I think we all know prevention is better than the cure. It's better to look at the root cause and upstream issues earlier on, because then we'll have to tackle it at some point in our journey. It's better to do it now than later. So just even thinking about the economic recovery, I know it's the case in Canada, and imagine in Austria and UK as well. We mathematically cannot have a recovery if we don't get women back to work, if we don't get Black, Indigenous, racialized communities back to work, if we don't support the needs of people living with disabilities. It's actually something, and this crisis has really shown us, when any one community is suffering or is negatively impacted, that impacts us all. So that's one of the ways that we typically try to position intersectionality. It's an added advantage or something that benefits us all. And I think it's the reason why we mention this is because for example, the experiences of Black women are very, very different from the experiences perhaps of, newcomer women coming from Europe to Canada, right? It's just different experiences require different measures. So that's partly why we adopt this analytical framework. And, something else I do want to kind of share is around just one specific group that has been negatively impacted, and now this will add a generational lens, is in Canada, Gen Z women make up 2.5% of Canada's workforce, but they experience 17% of the job losses. So we're also seeing that generation is also very racially diverse. Many are the children of immigrants. And so there is a real potential, if we don't also address the needs of the younger generations, they may experience the fallout of this crisis for the next 10 years. And again, that will have implications on all of us, because in Canada, for example, we have also an aging population. Immigration is one of the tools that we use to strengthen our labor market, but also it's very important for supporting the social safety net. So all of these issues are interconnected, and definitely recognize the complexity. But, I go back to the point, we can address it now, or we can address it later when it's much more difficult. So maybe I'll stop there for now.
Also want to say that, of course, it's very important to really look at it in a broad sense, not maybe also only looking at gender is not enough. So intersectionality is, of course, a big issue also when thinking about essential jobs. So who is working at care? I don't know, in Austria, we have the big issue of people, or women primarily from Romania, doing 24 hours care work. They weren't allowed to come into the country, or also very difficult situation for them and how to deal with that. So I think what the crisis has also shown us, those problems were there before. So it's nothing new per se, but now we can really put the finger on it. And we can really say, okay, those were issues being there before and kind of growing in magnitude. And I think we should also use this momentum to, okay, this crisis has really shown us these issues, and different groups being differently affected, different groups of women and men being able to work from home in the first case, and others having to go to work every day and still having to arrange who's taking care of their children, etc. So I think this is now really time to kind of use this momentum, and because these challenges, they won't disappear in the near future. The issues that have been there before will prevail, so to say, and to some extent, be worse. So also we know that some women who reduce their working time or maybe stop their little jobs, so to say, their side jobs, this also has long-lasting impacts on their life income, their pensions. So if we don't, as Anjum said, if we don't get those women back to work, we also will see the consequences later on. And I think this is what I want to say for now.
That's great, Melanie.
Yeah, okay, thanks. One of the concerns I have is that when this crisis starts to peter out, as hopefully it will in the not too distant future, that people will forget a lot about what we should be learning. This is kind of like a part of human nature. And one noticed this specifically last year, because we had the first wave, which was actually quite mild in comparison. And by the time you got to like June, July, and people were thinking about summer holidays, it was like, oh, it's over, great. And at that point, nothing was really learned, with some exceptions. I think in the UK, they did learn. They had to do something, which was the basis of the vaccination program success. But in many countries, I felt also in Austria, there was a rather lackadaisical attitude. Now we have the crisis that has impacted for so long. There is a chance that people will have this, wake-up call and think, oh, we were really unprepared. And how can we be prepared for maybe other crises that could come, whether it will be another pandemic, whether it will be a blackout. We just don't have crisis management written into our DNA in politics. And therefore, this cooperation that we have kind of in a very fumbled ad hoc way built up must have a roadmap, a kind of booklet for crisis management, which we could haul out at various points to sort of see how can we do this better. And obviously gender would be a very specific chapter within that. Another thing which is highlighted in the UK was that this huge tragic death rate, particularly from last year, hit Black Asian communities most. There have been some studies from Sussex, Manchester universities which document this as a fact. In some Black Asian communities in London, whole members of families were victims, and they've lost their mothers, their grandmothers and fathers, etc. And why is this? We have to look at this in much more detail, but one possibility is that in any case, your level of health in the UK depended on your postcode. You know, like if you were living in a southern affluent area, then you had good access to health facilities. And this whole problem has been highlighted, and we have to learn from that. I think also, in addition to this, looking in our own societies, where there's a lot to learn, I think we have to look at this globally. It's a global pandemic, therefore our response and our lessons to be learned can only be global. And what are we doing right now? We're thinking back to nationalism in many ways, whether it's sort of getting into all the politics of vaccine export, because there's a scarcity of this commodity, which is almost like gold or oil in the past. And so the nationalism, I think, a return to is something which we have to try to combat, because it can only be when we work together globally that we can have anything sustainable in terms of learning lessons for the future.
Great. You know, I think it's probably worth another seminar to think about what might happen globally in the recovery phase for exactly the reason that you mentioned, Melanie, namely that memories can be short. And as the crisis fades, I ask myself whether in certain parts of the world there will be a big focus on shoring up the economic drivers in different economies. In Southern Ontario, it's the auto manufacturing industry that drives a good chunk of the economy. If you focused mainly on supporting that sector, you would have a very disproportionate effect on women. So I ask myself that question. I want you to come back in on it, Melanie, and maybe I'll also just use the opportunity then to give you the last word, but then pivot to my next question, which is, UK, Canada, Austria are three very wealthy countries in the world, advanced democracies, advanced economies, etc. How would we expect the numbers that Judith discussed in her presentation to play out in the global South? And how do we are there any lessons that we can take from our quite privileged experiences with all of their warts and apply those in a helpful way to other parts of the world? So, but maybe Melanie, a final word on the economic side.
Well, I just wanted to elaborate really on that, because I feel that this pandemic has hit Europe for six, basically, and the UK, which we all regarded were fairly stable, healthy, economically. Okay, we had a lot, and we always were moaning about having nothing, but now we realize really what we had. And so a very affluent part of the world, in essence. And there we have now this spectacle where the EU is basically begging for vaccination program. My only worry again is that when the crisis starts to subside a little bit, that again Europe will feel okay, but of course this pandemic will certainly not be over in Africa, in Asia, and in South America. And we will go back to feeling like, okay, what's that got to do with us? You know, we have enough problems of our own, because it will take a long, long time to rebuild anything in economic terms to get back to the levels we were before the pandemic, because so much state money has been pumped into just rescuing and trying to keep alive the economy. At some point, it's got to be paid back. And therefore, it must be a kind of like, it's kind of a Europe first attitude or whatever, this kind of nationalism coming back. And the losers in this will certainly be the so-called third world. So the first world will feel, oh, we don't have it quite as good as we thought. You know, we're in a real mess, and to hell with the rest of the world. And I think that has to be something of an awareness, which is going to be a message funneled into governments. We already see that there is this danger in the UK where development aid is being cut because they feel they have got new priorities now. And that is a real problem, I think.
I'm sorry to come in again, but I just wanted to pick up on that, Melanie, to just say that one of the things that keeps diplomats up at night now is the possibility that the pandemic has placed the Sustainable Development Goals permanently out of reach for most of the world. But just to reinforce that point you make, everyone's going to be hurting, and finance departments at a certain point in a recession are going to claw back money, right? And so how do we finance all these things that need to be done in the world? It's a whole other challenge, I think. Judith or Anjum, do you want to come in on these points?
Yeah, for sure. If I can share a bit, I think, for countries around the world, whether in the global south or the global north, we have to really take our lessons around what has been saving us during this crisis. And it's been things like healthcare, the social safety net, the social determinants of health. I come actually from a public health background, and I just want to pick up on a point that Melanie raised is in Canada, we experienced the SARS crisis, and there was many lessons from that. And it just really showed the importance of public health measures. And so I really wouldn't be remiss if I didn't talk about how, that crisis has taught us in Canada. So let's make sure that lesson, but also the lesson of this COVID-19 pandemic is not lost on us, that those are some of the things, when public health works, we don't see it. But when it's not working, that's when we see the issues, right? So I think that's one thing I wanted to mention. The other thing I wanted to mention is really investing in the things that really keep us healthy and well as a society, and starting to see, can finance departments actually start to track that against economic measures as well. So I know in some parts of the world, there's been conversations about a well-being budget. So these are some of the things that could help to cement some of the understandings we've had from this time. I think it's really incumbent on all of us to think about, what is the legacy? What do we want to tell the next few generations that we learned from this crisis globally? And what will be the remnants of that? And I think for me, the remnant with that, my hope is a very strong care-based economy. In Canada, Armenia Lazine, one of Canada's economists, talked about, in Canada, 1 in 5 jobs is in what we call the care economy. So education, social services, healthcare, and that kind of sector. And that represents 12% of the GDP. So globally, we're seeing retail may not come back in the same way. Tourism will look very different. Hospitality, even other sectors that were severely impacted. So where should those workers go? And I think for me, globally, there's a care deficit. There's much more people that require care than have it. So I think that's a place where it's good for the economy, it's good for workers, also what's going to keep us resilient for the next crisis. And many people have talked about COVID-19 in many ways is the dress rehearsal for climate change, which is the other kind of perennial challenge that's on our doorstep. So I think globally, what I'd like to see as a legacy of this time is a movement towards the care-based economy. And I think that's where hopefully many countries can come on board, the global South and the global North.
If I can add to that, I think you raised some very important issues, and the care indeed is kind of also the backbone of the paid economy, and we should never forget about it. but it's also, of course, care sectors which is paid, such as healthcare, education, etc. But we should also talk about the pay level that there is, that we've seen how important it is during this crisis. And I think one learning could also be just to rediscuss, okay, you mentioned well-being, so what kind of society do we want to be? What do we value? And is this actually the way we remunerate it in kind of wages? Does that fit? And I think second part is what was very, for us in our study, very important. We also kind of need data on unpaid work, which is not in the official statistics. And if it's not in the official statistics, we tend to forget about it and not talk about it if we don't know about it. It's out there, it's happening anyways. So I think this also should be maybe not yearly, but in a regular time period. For Austria, the last time use study was from 2008 and 2009. So what changed in between them, we don't even know. So we don't have any data to compare it to, okay, what time was spent on unpaid work now during the crisis compared to before the crisis. We simply don't know. And I think this is also a very important issue. And I think this goes for the global north, for the global south, just to make this visible and take it kind of out of the shadow, all this care work, also done in the official statistics in the healthcare sector, educational sector, but also all the unpaid work that is done in the households, just to put it on the forefront, to talk about it in politics, about governance, how to improve it, how to deal with this as a society. We also need data for that.
Terrific. Look, I want to do give one more question to the panel. We don't have any questions from the floor, but I'm interested if we could just pull on one thread from Melanie's presentation. You mentioned, Melanie, that there was a kind of a blindness in the legislation making process in the UK that had been picked up on. And I can tell you, as a public servant in Canada, we started to see a lot of change when we were required, starting about 5 years ago, to do a gender-based analysis. No, we do gender-based plus analysis, et cetera. But about 5 years ago, when we started to be required to analyze the impact of all proposed programs and spending on gender, do a gender analysis. And I know that this is also something that they're starting in Austria here, from my discussions with the government. I wonder if there are other very practical things that would feed the kind of change that you're talking about, that could be presented as recommendations to government. And while you're answering that question, I'd be interested to hear from each of the panelists, is there something that you feel your government has done particularly well in the pandemic? And if so, what is it? Because it is always easier in government to build on successes. I think we all know that. So I'll put that question, maybe we'll start this time with you, Melanie, and then go through to Judith and Anjum, and then I will say a few words before maybe turning to you, Ambassador Brix, to make any closing remarks. Over to you, Melanie.
Yeah, thank you. I think the term used was institutional thoughtlessness. They just didn't really kind of think, what does it matter what we're doing here as far as the impact on women is concerned. But also there's gender budgeting, like in Austria, presumably in Canada. Now, the problem was that there was then a crisis. A year ago, there was a need to take a decision very quickly. And so all the usual mechanisms, the checks and balances, the discussions, the consultation procedures in Parliament, they were done away with. And it became a very much executive decision, so government-based, in cabinet at prime ministerial level. And so very little consultation. Now, this raises another question. Is basically in a crisis, you don't have the luxury to go around saying, you know, what's the impact going to be on women or on Black people or whatever, because that takes a good consultation procedure, will take about 10 to 12 weeks. Now, by that time, you know, we'd all be dead. So you just don't do it. But we could actually, if there was a crisis management handbook, you know, of some general points, would be what kind of snap impact assessment could you do in a crisis without doing it in a 12-week time span? That might not be possible, but one suggestion would be that you would immediately reach out to civil society groups. You would reach out to women's organizations like that, the Fawcett Society. And this was not done, you know, but it would only take, you know, a phone call or just a small inner circle consultation to just whip round and say, in your experience, and particularly now we've had the pandemic experience, if we take this decision, and we have to do it by tomorrow, yeah, because time is of the essence, what should we be considering? And these civil society, women's movements, or Black people's organizations might say, look, if you do that, you're going to have a problem. So it would make people just think twice, because we didn't have any thinking of twice. It went through Parliament. There were various decrees. They went through Parliament in just a matter of hours in two chambers. There was no discussion. People were frightened, and it was genuine fear in those early days. Now we should learn that we have to take more considered, balanced decisions within a kind of very condensed time frame in a crisis, because they will have a long-term impact that could be counterproductive on the whole thing. So basically a kind of core package of what to do in a crisis to make sure you do a minimum of consultation. And this was completely lacking a year ago, for understandable reasons, it must be said, because none of our politicians of any generation had ever been confronted with such a problem in peacetime. But now, you know, they could do something to pull their socks up a bit, really.
So I think what the Austrian government in terms of labor market policies was really the short-time work scheme that we have in Austria, which is quite generous. So people are able to reduce their working time and still get paid, I think, around 90% of their last wage, or I'm not sure about the numbers, but still kind of keep the income level, but reducing the working time if in their company firm there isn't enough work. So really kind of preventing unemployment, and this is paid by the government. So we also see that the Austrian government is spending a lot of money on the crisis, and this is probably a good thing to do right now. And it's also the short-time working scheme is still going on, so it's still continuing. And I think there's also more money being spent on unemployment policies or targeted at women. So there is a focus there, or at least there is the awareness there that unemployment is a big issue for women. And of course, it's also closely connected where women work. So in Austria, there's a lot of labor market segmentation, women working in hospitality and tourism, and people trying get that back on track. But I think it's also important to state that it's not only tourism, so it's also the service sector. So it's a bit broader. So just by focusing on tourism, it does too little, but people, I think the awareness is getting bigger. But I think what we should also pay attention to, this might be more in the future, but we've seen it with the last crisis. If people spend a lot during the crisis, but then again, after the crisis, if the government wants to save money, and here is also where we should pay close attention to, and this can sometimes lead to, okay, where can we save money? And this might be sectors where a lot of women are employed, it might be the public health sector. So I think we should already be aware of that in the future, the time might be, and we know that from the previous crisis, that austerity affected women more than men. And I think this is also one thing to keep in mind and be aware.
Just want to building on Melanie and Judith's commentary. I think I want to pick up on a point that Melanie raised just around that lack of diversity in decision making and at leadership tables, and how that actually has downstream negative impacts on communities who are most affected. So whether there's a lack of gender diversity, a lack of racial diversity, generational diversity, a diversity of all kinds, when we actually don't have those voices and perspectives at the decision making table, the simple fact is that those decisions will not be fully representative, right? And so I absolutely agree with Melanie's point about how do we start to show that we can all be coming to the table together. Depending on the political climate of a country, sometimes there is, rightly or perhaps not rightly, challenges between civil society and government working together, because part of the role of civil society is to hold governments to account. But I think what we're realizing in this moment, because of what a crisis it is, we need every single perspective at the table. And I think one of the things in Canada that I'm really looking forward to seeing is around the task force for women in the economy. So it's 18 people the Minister of Finance has chosen to sit on this table. There's representatives from civil society, private sector, academia, labor, and a few other parts of society, some women majority sectors as well, because there's a lack of time, we actually need people who are seeing changes in real time to actually share that perspective right away. We unfortunately can't wait, 2 years to fully track, because by then, that window for some of the actions we need to take may be lost, right? So I think that's something that I'm looking forward to, and I would really hope to see other countries also adopt, because a recent study showed that of 30 OECD countries, many of those recovery task force, women made up only 23%, despite the fact often many countries, they're 50 or over of the population, 50 or over percentage of the population. I think something where in Canada, we've seen this challenge, and maybe in other countries too, there's certain responsibilities the federal government has, certain responsibilities that the subnational governments have. And there's always this kind of, it's not our job, to take on this issue, it's the other level of government and vice versa. And we've seen this for decades in Canada around childcare. It's been actually this 50-year ambition of women and feminist movements across the country to see this nationwide early learning and childcare system. And I'm hoping in this pandemic, we'll actually see those divisions start to break down, because we're seeing how we need everyone to kind of be in alignment. And I think about in Canada, when I think about the Canada Health Act and how we actually produced the universal healthcare system we have in Canada, it started with one province. It started with the province of Saskatchewan, and it was after World War II. And, that happened in one province, and then it spread across the country. And I think the same thing could happen with things like childcare. We have some promising work in the province of Quebec. Can we see that across the country? And I think that's part of the challenge. Sometimes, these issues of post-pandemic recovery seem so large, but we actually have in all countries things that have worked in one jurisdiction that perhaps we can scale up, whether it's around childcare, whether it's addressing gender-based violence, whether it's addressing homelessness. All of these issues, people started to do work on it. Let's see what we can scale up and what we can start to tailor make for a different jurisdiction. So I think that's what we need to lean into, and it's hard because it's not perhaps what we used to do in post-pandemic times, but I think because of the challenge before us, that's what we need to do now to create the society we need.
Thanks very much, Anjum, and all of the presenters. I very much like the idea of harvesting the kernels of solutions that exist already and trying to grow those. Look, I just want to thank all of you very sincerely for your participation in a really fascinating discussion here. I can tell you, as a woman who homeschooled a 7-year-old for 2.5 months last spring while crisis managing my embassy, it really spoke to me in so many ways. I'm not going to try to summarize what was said here today, but I know that we've all learned something to go away and think about. There's a lot to be thought of. I can say that from a Canadian government perspective, we believe very deeply in working collaboratively with the international community to develop gender responsive solutions to the far-reaching gender impacts of this crisis, and that we really do believe, as Herr Brix said at the beginning, that you don't waste a good crisis, that we don't want to just come out of this replicating existing policies and approaches to things, but rather to seize the opportunity to build a more equitable and inclusive and just society. And for us, that's what we mean when we say build back better. And so I just want to say a real thank you to all of you for your insights. I'd also like to thank our partners in organizing today's events, the Go Governance Institute and the Vienna Diplomatic Academy. I really appreciate the collaboration. Let's do this more often, is what I would say. And I want to just close there and say thank you all once again. And over to you, Ambassador Brix, for the final word.
Thank you, Ambassador. It was a fantastic discussion that we had. I really enjoyed what you said about looking towards the recovery and how we should actually work on building a better society coming out of this. I am always optimistic, but as Anjum said at the beginning, she looked into how we dealt with the crisis in 1917, 1918, and it looked a bit similar. So we have to be careful that it doesn't look too similar how we react to the crisis. And I was very thankful for Anjum saying that at least in the wealthy part of the world, we are going towards a care-based economy. And this is, to my mind, a good sign for women. And because, as we know, in this care-based economy, women have to be better paid. They have to have better conditions because they are bearing the brunt of what's going on there. So I would say, for me, it was also sort of eye-opener that maybe we have to be careful. The argument there is not so much about gender equity for the finance ministers or for the health ministers. The argument there is really we need to be prepared to have enough care workers, to have a health system and so on. So maybe we can also rely on issues which help the cause without talking at the beginning about gender equity. And also when Melanie said SNAP impact assessment, fully true. Also in the Austrian case, there was no little impact assessment at the very beginning of the executive orders that we had. And actually our constitutional court had actually rejected some of the executive orders for this very reason, that this was not the case. So the good thing we did, at least, is the short time scheme was a real, I think, positive game changer. And the short time scheme, when you look into the figures in Austria, helped more women than men for the obvious reasons that more women were concerned with. So thank you very much from my side. Also, I'm convinced that, I learned at least, we had been in this crisis for long enough to target our measures better towards also helping the cause of equity than we did. The very last word is, I was surprised about one thing in this discussion. Nobody mentioned the word family once. Whatever that means, for good or for worse, I just realized that in 90 minutes talking about gender equity and the impact of COVID, the word family was not used. But we are in politics. So we have around us countries where family policies, very traditional family policies, are still around. Just our neighboring country, Hungary, is a good example for traditional family policy, or look towards Russia. So we have to take this also into account. But I didn't want to talk about contents too much. I just want to say thank you. And I promise that if you're interested in the Canadian Embassy to work with us, Ambassador, we are very open and looking forward to this. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks to you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.